So, Peter, Coyote, thank you very much for joining me at Rewind Yourself today. Welcome.
Thank you. I'm happy to be here.
Wonderful. When we exchanged first messages between each other, when you replied to my invitation, you wrote, "Let's just play jazz and see where we go." I love that because it struck me as a sentence that could describe your entire life. So I think let's do exactly that. If we rewind your life, not to the highlight reel, but to the moment that actually made you, where do we begin?
Okay. So I think I would begin at my mother's nervous breakdown when I was about 3, and she was incapacitated. She was like an eggplant. And my dad at that time was a very wealthy man, very driven, type A businessman, and he could not stop minting money. So my aunt sent a young 19-year-old black girl from Henderson, North Carolina, to come and help out in our house. And my house was not a happy house. If you're a child and your parent just goes vacant, it's very anxiety producing. You can look up on the internet still face encounters with infants, and you can see a child who's with a warm and loving mother is just a happy, gurgling infant, and then the mother makes a stone face, and the child immediately gets anxious and goes through its repertoire of things to try to get affection, and within 60 seconds is weeping. So that's kind of what my household was like, trying to get my mother's attention and affection. And this young black woman named Sue Howard, came into our life and just picked up all the troubles and threw them on her shoulder and became a safe place for my sister and I. And she brought her friends over in the kitchen every day. There was a community of black people: John and Violet Ellerby, Jules Monk, my father's chauffeur, Chris. And my mom would be sitting out in the living room with a glass of scotch or playing solitaire. And in the kitchen, black people would be listening to jazz, arguing about politics and the Bible, and most importantly, paying attention to me. And made it safe to be who I was. So by the time I was 10, I completely understood and rejected whiteness. I saw the way people treated my white mother. By that time, it was up and about, and the way they treated my black mother, and I was furious about it. There's no question that I'm a Caucasian, but whiteness is a political statement. It's a statement about how much protection you can expect to receive from the state and the government. So that was a big setup for me. The second was my dad had a best friend whose name was Buddy Jones, who was a bebop jazz musician. And Buddy was from Hope, Arkansas, and he had been Charlie Parker's roommate in Kansas City and moved east. He'd been smoking pot since he was 15 years old, and was a guy who, you would say as a jazz musician, he was always on the one. He was always in the immediate moment, the first beat. And he was kind of a surrogate father for me. So I had Sue Howard and Ozzie Nelson, who was the man she eventually married. And they lived with and took care of me till I was about 14. And they moved away but stayed in the same town. And we stayed close until I buried her at 91 or 92. Buddy Jones was someone that I could talk to. He took me around to hear jazz, introduced me to Thelonious Monk, to Miles Davis, took me to hear Billie Holiday's last concert when I was 15 years old, and really gave me this insight into a life and a mind that could be improvisatory and not based on status and achievement and all the things that white people seem to take as so important. And not only white people, but Jews. Because when I was born, Jews were not white. My people were Jews. And Jews did not become white in America until the 60s. So when I was growing up and when my dad was beginning business, there was all sorts of rules making life difficult for him that infuriated him. And when I was a kid, I would see things like I couldn't join the country club a block from my house. So when my friends and I were playing in the summer and got hot, they could run off and go swimming. I couldn't. It's not like the suffering of black people, but it gave you a sense of being other. And then probably the third most important lesson was around the time I was 12 to 14, the McCarthy period hearings were going on. And for your younger viewers, after we'd helped win World War II, the American political class understood that we were going to be in competition with Russia and communism for world's resource and power. And rather than just teach their people and explain things, what they did was create a red scare where everything red was evil, traitorous, treacherous, treasonous. Well, so I started out being a Jew. Then I found out I had communists in my family. I had socialists in my family. They were my old uncles and aunts who were spilling food on themselves and arguing that Trotsky was a man. Trotsky, Stalin, he was a pig. Trotsky was the guy. Anyway, these people couldn't overthrow a pushcart, but they were labor organizers, they were school teachers, they were public servants. And I became infuriated that the government would lie about my family. These were people who, in their 20s, maybe were fascinated with communism. And then they saw who Stalin was, they outgrew it, they did something else. But now they were being called into Congress, forced to testify against their friends and mates. And if they didn't, they would probably lose their jobs and lose their employment. So I can't remember. I may have saluted the flag once. Certainly not until I was an adult, when I made friends who were soldiers and had been servicemen and some in the CIA. But so my life was begun in a kind of counterculture perspective, aligned with black people, aligned with Jews, and aligned with leftists. So that's where, to me, the foundational changes occurred.
So you mentioned your father, that he was very successful in what he was doing. Your father was a Wall Street stockbroker. You became the person who tried to abolish Wall Street. What was the relationship actually like? Not the politics of it, but what it felt like between the two of you. Can you go deeper into
Well,
this?
he didn't try to abolish Wall Street. He was a polymath. He was very brilliant. He went to MIT at 15 years old, the great engineering school in outside of Boston. And he was very, very brilliant. He was physically dangerous. He was a trained fighter. He was a sparring partner with Philadelphia Jack O'Brien, who was a world light heavyweight champion at the time. But he had a great deal of trauma in his life, rage and anger. And he didn't understand me at all. He might have been afraid that I was gay. I was a little vague, poetic, sensitive kid. And my sister was sort of the tough one in the family. And she could do anything. She could get in his face. She could talk back. He would say things to me like, I'll break your fucking legs and send you to reform school. So there was a lot of physical intimidation. He knocked me out at my first boxing lesson when I was 6. And when my mother went crazy from that point on, he gave me wrestling lessons, Greco-Roman wrestling lessons. He was a very good, almost Olympic qualifier wrestler. And it was never safe around him. I admired him. People respected him. He was the president of a railroad, the president of an oil company. He was the banker in an English colonial and American colonial antiques business that sold to the Rockefellers and the DuPonts. And he smuggled Charolais cattle, these white French cows, into the United States with a partner in Texas by painting black spots on them and running them across the border as Holsteins, because the Angus and Hereford breeders had made a law against bringing these magnificent animals in. So he was wildly successful until he lost everything, literally everything. So we were not close. I don't think I ever spent a weekend with him. just alone doing something for me. We didn't play catch, we didn't play football. And the subtext of most of his wrestling lessons was that he was supposedly toughening me up and teaching me how to fight, which he did, and teach me how to hurt people, but taught me by hurting me and giving me these running lectures and disguising the fact that he was hurting me behind pedagogy. You see, when you get a wrist bone against somebody's forehead, see how much that hurts? Hurts like a son of a bitch, doesn't it? So, as soon as I could get out of there, I got out of there. And by the time I was 14, I was taking the bus into Greenwich Village in New York City. I was interested in folk music and interested in literature, and I was reading the beats, and I was trying to find voices and perspectives to help me express my dissatisfaction.
And did your father ever understand what you were doing with your life? And did you need him to understand?
He did. About 4 months before he died, he came out to a commune where I was living. It was very poor, very hard scrabble. He came out in the middle of a blizzard with my mother, unannounced. He had a case of whiskey and 1,000 secanols, which are barbiturates, big red pills. There were Hell's Angels there. There were 15 people crowded in a house without electricity with a 5-gallon hot water heater. And he and my mom showed up in this unannounced. There was a blizzard of rain going on for 3 days. And I remember people offering my mother a joint, and she'd say, "No, thank you, darling. I have my Viceroys." Anyway, he was in the kitchen, Hell's Angels on either side of him, punching holes in secanols and giving them to those guys. So I went into the kitchen about 11 o'clock at night, and the angels were passed out, and my dad was about in his cups, and he looked at me and he said, "You're a better man than I am." I was shocked because usually he told me I was dumber than, I was just dumber than a pile of rocks. He would say, "I know you have 3 numbers in your IQ. I don't know where the fucking decimal point is." And I just never got direct compliments. So I said to him, "What are you talking about?" And he waved his hand to indicate the commune and the whole thing. And I said, Dad, this is not even a dress rehearsal. I mean, this is just poor people living together and trying to get by." He said, I know. But you take care of each other and you share what you have." And I thought, holy shit, he sees it. So I said, well, I could use a little advice, I could use a little help. And he looked at me and he passed out. His head hit the table with a big thump. And I just sat there, and then he woke up. And this is what he said to me verbatim in the winter of 1970. He said, "Capitalism is dying of its internal contradictions. And I ought to know because I'm one of them. Believe me when I tell you that the sons of bitches running everything don't give a shit about you and your children. They don't even care about their children and grandchildren. They've paid their dues and they want to take what they feel they're owed. They're going to sell everything that's not nailed down. You think revolution is going to take 2 or 3 years? It's going to take 50. So you better prepare yourself for the long haul. Keep your family close. Be close to the people you love. Watch out. Don't let these sons of bitches fall on you, because it's going to be a tumultuous change." So it's 55 years later, 56 years later. I've never found him false on one point. So that opened up a feeling in me that we could have a dialogue. So that spring, we were evicted. And when I called him from the road, we were living in a truck caravan, 9 vehicles, 11 adults, 19 adults, 11 kids. And I stopped a call from Utah, and we had a nice little chat. And then he was dead 2 months later. I never saw him again. So I at least had the inkling that he kind of got a picture of what I was dedicated to.
So he left you quite a lot to think about.
So it was lucky that I had been in the counterculture, because when he lost his money, he lost all his money when we invaded Cuba, because he had all his safekeeping, save your life money, all his relatives' money in American government bonds on what's called margin. And margin means you pay 10% and you have the stock. And as long as the stock stays valuable, the guy you borrowed them from knows that his money is safe. But if the stock loses $1 a share and you have 1 million shares, you have to give him $1 million to stay current with him. And he got something like a $25 million margin call in 1962, which would be like $250, $300 million today. No one knew about it. He managed to keep everything going for another 9 years. And it was only at the funeral that my mother found out that they were flat broke. She had to sell 3 houses, the lands, the rugs, the hounds, the cars, the books, everything. And she wound up at, 57, a poor little old white lady living on the wrong side of the tracks. And he just, like, après moi le déluge. He just
Yeah.
all went down the drain.
You renamed yourself Peter Coyote in a peyote ceremony in the Sonoran Desert. Most people keep the name they were giving and build an identity inside it. You choose to create yours from scratch. What does it feel like to name yourself?
That's a good question. So when I did that, I didn't know what it meant. When I was in college, we had sent to a place in Texas called Moore's Orchid Farm and gotten a big box of peyote, hallucinogenic cactuses. And we didn't know what to do with them, but we were college students. So we went to the library and we found out that 30 miles from the college was an Indian reservation where there was a peyote church. So we went over there and I found a guy, I'd already been to jail for trying to smuggle drugs, marijuana into the United States. And we found a guy and we gave him half the peyote and he showed us how to prepare it and take it. So we were sitting in a friend's room and my friend Terry Bisson, wonderful writer, the guy who edited every one of my books until he died 2 years ago, nothing was happening. So he just stood up to go and he said, "Hey, my hands are dizzy." And the minute he said that, everybody got high as a kite. So I got up with him. And when we went outside, I said to him, and I forgot this, he reminded me of this years later. I said to him, "Hey, Terry, I don't know what's happening, man, but I feel like I'm some kind of little wolf. I'll see you later." And I just started dog trotting, and I dog trotted all night long through the night in Iowa. And in the morning, I woke up in a cornfield, and all around me in the cornfield were these little footprints. And I didn't know if I had made them or animals had made them. I didn't know much about it. So about 3 years later, I got out of college. I was living with a Paiute Indian man, a Shoshone Paiute medicine man. And I was fixing his toilets and fixing his cars and doing errands. I pulled one of his sons out of a cult commune. And one day we were having a smoke and I told him about this episode. And he said, "Well, what are you going to do about it?" I said, "What do you mean, what am I going to do?" He said, "Well, the universe opened its mind to you. You can treat it as a hallucination if you want. That's okay. You'll just stay a white man. You'll have a good life. You'll do whatever you're going to do. But if you explore it and open yourself to it, you might become a human being." And I thought that sounded interesting. So I thought about it for about 3 months. And I changed the name. I changed my name as the first step in understanding it. And there was an immediate unintended consequence, which was nobody on earth knew who Peter Coyote was. I didn't. So it freed me in a certain way of all sorts of past history and problems and gave me a kind of present concentration. Where's the rabbit going to jump out of the bush? I just have to stay alert and follow it. And it turned out it was my true name. And over the years, it's like I just refuse to change it. It's on my passport. It's on all my legal ID. And if you mean it, if you're really instructed by something deep, it's a kind of transformation out of a domesticated life into a wild and improvisatory life.
The diggers. That's going to be my next question. Give everything
Okay.
away: food, clothing, theater, medical care, and yourselves. You literally try to remove yourselves from the money economy entirely. What does it actually feel like to live that way day to day? Not the ideology, but the experience.
Well, let me just clarify the ideology a little bit, because you're pretty good. So in the 1960s, most of the social change movements were basically socialist or communist in their background. People were carrying the little red book. Most of the options for culture and ideologies were socialist or far left Democrat. The Diggers were all, we were all artists in a theater called the San Francisco Mime Troupe, which was a street theater, radical improvisatory theater, very, very left wing. And these two guys, Emmett Grogan and Billie Murcott, came out from New York and brought the idea of the Diggers to us. And the Diggers were an English group from the 16th, I think it was the 16th century in England, when the king stole the commons from the common people where they used to graze their animals and raise their gardens. And he put his sheep there to feed, no, it's probably 17th century, to feed his new woolen mills. And the Diggers were the first people who said private property is theft. And they fought the king, and the king sent Oliver Cromwell against them. And they were called the Diggers because every morning they were seen burying their dead. So we like that kind of spirit. We like that kind of attitude against private property. And our intuition was that Americans were never going to throw themselves on the barricades to be the lumpen proletariat of Karl Marx. They just were not going to do it. Certainly not after the Red Scare and after socialism and communism had be so poisoned. But our intuition was that if people developed lives that they loved and respected, they might defend them. So what the Diggers did was we decided that private property and profit were the basis of the American system. That's what was causing the Vietnam War. That's what caused the Korean War. That was behind racism, all sorts of stuff. So when we decided to do things anonymously and free, it was a tactic. It was not a permanent economic plan. So the background was that Haight-Ashbury was becoming very famous. Kids were running away from all over the country, coming to San Francisco. San Francisco was all over the newspapers, and the city was capitalizing on the publicity. There were tourist buses running down the Haight-Ashbury with tourists looking at us like we were orangutans, and we would just spray paint the windows of the buses or the lenses of their cameras. We were just living our life. But there were a lot of kids who were runaways, and the city was doing nothing for them. Nothing. They were living hard scrabble, homeless lives. So we decided to feed them. And we decided to turn the feeding into theater. So we went to the farmers' markets, and the Italian guys would not give young, able-bodied men any food. So we sent our women with babies nursing at their breasts, and they gave them so much food. And we had these big steel milk cans. And we made big pots of stew, 20, 30 gallons of stew. And we put the word out on the street. There'd be a free meal in Golden Gate Park at 5 o'clock, bring a bowl and a spoon. And then we created a rectangle, a yellow rectangle, 6 feet by 6 feet. And it was called the free frame of reference. And all you had to do to get the food was step through the free frame of reference. And then we gave you a miniature one, like an inch by an inch on a shoelace, and we invited you to look at the world. How would you behave if this was free? How would you behave if that was free? So then we started free stores. And the first 2 were just piles of junk that people gave us. But by the third one, we had an actual store. We knew rich people who would give us money to do these kind of things. And we had clothing, we had tools, we had furniture, we had televisions, we had tools, we had everything you needed for a life. And the subtext, without ever saying it out loud, was, why do you want to become an employee to make the money to become a consumer? We'll give you the shit. Now what do you want to do with your life? And it basically created instances of radical exchange. So my favorite story was, I was behind the counter one day, and an elderly, large black woman was browsing the store. And I looked around and I saw that she was stealing stuff. It was ludicrous. How could you steal in a free store? So I went up to her. I said, "Pardon me, madam." She said, "Yeah." I said, "You can't steal in here." And she got indignant. She said, "I'm not stealing." I said, "I know you're not stealing. You can't steal because it's a free store. If you want something, just take it. You don't have to pretend to hide or look around. It's yours." She said, "It's mine?" I said, "Yeah." She said, "Then get out of my face." I said, "Okay." The next day, she came back with a flat of day-old jelly donuts, which she put on the counter. So this woman understood an exchange economy. So from the free store, we had medical students from the hospital come down every Wednesday night and treat people for free. Sexually transmitted diseases, acid overdoses, everything. Young doctors came down, and that center is still running. A man named David Smith began to study it for his PhD thesis, and it's still running. Another thing that we did was San Francisco was a shipping point for Vietnam, to send young soldiers to Vietnam. We had gotten a number of draft cards, which was official government ID, which explained the draft status of someone. If you were 1A, you were draft eligible. If you were 4F, you were ill. If you were 1Y, you were insane. And we had them, and we had the instructions how to fill them out. So if it was from an address in Georgia, we knew where the numbers should go. And we had to be very careful because it was a felony. But soldiers could come in, and with a little talk, they would hang their uniforms up with the free clothes. We told them to always keep the boots. They'd put on different clothes. And Billie from Ohio would leave as Tommy from Tennessee and just disappear into the crowds of Haight Street. And those people never murdered anybody. They were not wounded. They didn't wind up as homeless vets. So we did that for a long time. Your question was, what was the experience like? Well, we were living communally because we had no money. The only cash we actually had was women with children could get a small stipend from the governments, like social welfare. We would use that for the rent and the electricity. And then everything else, we would have to hustle money or take jobs or do something to keep ourselves going. And we did that for a couple of years. And then at a certain point, you think, well, wait, running a soup kitchen is not my highest aspiration in life. So after a few years of doing this, many of us moved out into the country and began setting up communes, strings of communes up along the West Coast all the way up into the edge of Canada. And we would travel back and forth. We would help one another. Some of them were backwoods communes, and we would collect stuff in the city and run it up to Black Bear, which would be snowed in from November through March. And then as kids came into the world, it forced certain changes. We had to start to make rules and order, and people who couldn't abide those rules would leave. But you really couldn't have Wino Eddie playing the tom-toms at 4 in the morning when mothers were waking up to nurse at 5. So little by little, people had to get jobs or move to where schools were because we didn't own our land. And we were often evicted. In one case, the Forest Service up near Black Bear burned about 20 homes where we were living, and under the excuse that we were panning for gold. But they knew we weren't, and we had been criticizing the Forest Service practice of irresponsible logging, so they burned us out. So we still have a group called Digger Bread, and there's 108 people chipping in money every month to keep about 15 of our people who got really old and are indigent with $200 a month above whatever Social Security or stuff they have. So we didn't change our values, but we adjusted to what we had to do to survive.
Okay. And the Diggers criticized the Grateful Dead for charging admission and Timothy Leary for monetizing LSD. You were radicals who held the counterculture itself to account. What does it feel like to be the most radical person in a room full of radicals?
Well, it made you, if you weren't careful, it made you vainly proud. I mean, the Grateful Dead could be in my house or Peter Berg's house or any place, and they could hear the sharpest ideas of the time coming out of the mouths of really smart people. And then I might read those in an interview by Jerry Garcia. And so we would often go to the Grateful Dead and ask them to fund a party for the people, but they were also competitive with us. And they'd say, "What's the matter, man? You don't have your money trip together?" Because what happened in the Haight, all those parties in Golden Gate Park were originally held by the Diggers. We would just go to a band and say, "Are you going to play? Will you come play here?" And we'd have food out, and we'd have Hell's Angels guarding the loudspeakers and the amplifiers, and we just have a party for the neighborhood. But the first 3 rock and roll light shows in San Francisco were held as benefits for the San Francisco Mime Troupe, my theater. And they were such a huge success. The first one was a fundraiser for Timothy Leary. They were such a huge success that suddenly record companies and clothing companies began to sense there was a market here. And they began moving through the community, giving out $100,000 advances to guys who the day before had just been our neighborhood buddies. So they established a 2-tiered class system. You had the rock and rollers who suddenly had lots of money, and everybody wanted to make clothes for them or hash pipes or guitars or something like that. And then we were living hard scrabble. Everyone knew it. We had a lot of respect for that. But we made a mistake generally as a counterculture. Generally, we made a dangerous political mistake. And that was, we were so proud of our thoughts and ideas and achievements and our style and our sexual freedom that we got way far ahead of the bulk of people who might have been ordinary liberals or just centrists. We forgot where the line was between conservative Democrats and fascists. And by forgetting that, we offended the people who were our political strength. And they elected Richard Nixon and Ronald Reagan and ushered in 20 years of anti-environment, anti-women, free-reign capitalism for 20 years largely because of our pride and smugness. And one of the things I try to teach today is that democracy is a numbers game. Hubert Humphrey may have been way to the right of me, but he was a Democrat running for president. But because he was so tepid about Vietnam, neither I nor many of our far left friends supported him. And he didn't win, Richard Nixon won. So you have to be kind of shrewd, and young people are often not shrewd.
I want to ask you about something that involves a real contradiction. You went from spending 3 years trying to abolish the money economy to working in one of the most money-driven industry in the world. Did you feel like a sellout? And if not, how did you hold those
Yeah,
two
it's a
things?
fair question. So first of all, we're not trying to abolish the money economy. We used money also. We had to. You know, the landlord was not going to take carrots for his rent. So the Diggers was theater to try to open people's minds as to how money was organizing your life or organizing your self-esteem. But the part of your question that was interesting was a real challenge to me. So my dad died. I came back to San Francisco. I'd been a heroin addict for 6 or 7 years. I knew I had to change my life. I had a daughter whose mother had run away. So I was a single father. I was, let me see, 19, I was about 32 years old, 33 years old when I came back. And I got interested in Zen, and I began sitting zazen and meditating at a Zen center there. And I had no money. My father died below broke. I had a child. I had responsibilities. And I was living in a future in which there was no longer a counterculture that you could count on. Ronald Reagan had come in, and they began uh, chaining up the surpluses, where we could go to the back of a supermarket and get enough food to feed 30 people. They were now selling that food to pig farmers. So everything was getting tougher and more constrained. So in 1975, my friend Gary Snyder, a pretty famous poet, one of the leaders of the beat poets, the most recognized, and he was a friend and mentor to me. He won the Pulitzer Prize. And the governor of California asked him to create an arts council of all working artists. He wanted to create something new. And Gary asked me to join him. And the Arts Council was a great success. Gary was the first chairman. I was the chairman for the next 4 years. And we raised the budget from $1 to $18 million a year. And we made really radical changes where the New York State Arts Council was imitating us, the National Endowment of the Arts, the Federal Arts was imitating us. And in doing that, I had learned to talk to conservatives, Republicans, rural people, city people. And I realized that I was not like a hippie any longer. I didn't have to be bound by that definition. And that my success at the Arts Council gave me the courage to try the movies. I just thought I'd try it. I'd been an actor. And I had exactly the problem that you put your finger on. I thought, holy shit, I've been a digger for, 8 years, living without ego, without money. I'm diving into this world of ego, ambition, wealth. How am I going to do this? Took a lot of thought. I meditated on these questions deeply. So the first thing I thought about was I could not have any control over the content of the movie that I was making if I was successful. I could control the way I worked, the way I did the movie. If I found the movie odious, I could not do it. Something else would come up. But the vow that I took was that I would always be on the set, first on the set. I would be prepared with my work. I would be democratically equal with everyone I worked with, whether it was an assistant or whether it was a superstar or the director. I treated everyone the same way. But in order to get a job, I thought, let me see, in 1979, which was when I got my Actors Union card, I was 39. So I thought, holy shit, I'm 39 years old. There's better looking, more talented people out there. How am I going to do this? And I decided I would have to be a star already. And I thought, okay, what would that mean? So I thought about all the various movie stars, and I thought of Paul Newman. And I thought of him because he seemed very human. He was doing a lot of work in charity, a lot of stuff for other people. You never found him in scandals. He didn't act all puffed up. So I analyzed him. And I thought, okay, when Paul Newman goes into a meeting, what is he thinking about? He's already a star. He's not trying to impress the director and be a nice guy and be liked, which is what everyone does. He's asking himself, are these guys serious? Do I want to spend my time with them? What are their ideas? So that's how I would go into a room, and you could see these guys were startled because everybody goes in trying to be popular. And I went in, no attitude, but just, well, what's your take on this movie? How are you thinking about it? And I'd listen to what they had to say judiciously. And they understood they were being judged. And it was such a transference of status that they would tell my agent. My agent said I closed more auditions than any actor he'd ever met, every other one. And so I just worked out techniques. You know, if I was going to read, I'd say, well, okay, I haven't spoken to you, so I'll give you my first take on the character, and then you give me notes, and I'll do it again. I knew they could never resist giving me notes because it made them authoritative, and I got myself 2 tries. So I was very lucky, and for about 10 years, I had a very fast career and a lot of success. It was never where I lived. I always lived in my heart as a writer. I didn't like celebrity. I didn't like people recognizing me on the street that I had to be polite to and charming to. And I'm just now rereading my journals of that time. I was just running like a hamster in a wheel, going from interviews to jobs to fashion shows to this. It was exhausting while I was trying to raise a child, while I was getting divorced, while I was trying to keep school, housing, tuition, everything in play. So I did my best. This is the world I lived in. And I will say that in every movie I ever did, and I did 160 of them, somebody would come up to me and say, hey, do you have any kind of religion or something? I'd say, well, why? He'd say, I don't know, man. You're nice to everyone. You never pick fights. You treat me with respect, no different than the director or the other stars. I've never seen anybody like that. And I'd say, well, yeah, as a matter of fact, I do. I'm a Buddhist. And I could talk to them about Zen Buddhism. So, you know, I did that until my children were out of graduate school, debt free, and then I retired. And now I spend my time, I've written 7 books. That's what I love to do. And it was good to me, but I can't say I always enjoyed it. As a matter of fact, I used to describe my career sometimes to people as humping donkeys for tourists in Tijuana.
Okay. But you became the voice that tells the world stories to the world, documentaries, narrations, hundreds of them. There's something about something almost Buddhist about the role itself. The self disappears entirely into the story of others. What does something you choose? Was this something you choose consciously or something you stumbled into?
Well, I actually began doing voiceovers before I ever got in the movies. I got to San Francisco. I was completely broke. So I made a CD of myself in 10 different accents, telling people what a shitbag Peter Coyote was and to stay away from him, you know. You couldn't put him in a room with a woman. He'll jump on her like a kangaroo. And I just did all of these voices and all of these things. and I put my name and number on it. And then I looked up every advertising agency in San Francisco. And I said, I'm new in town. I'm a voiceover guy from New York. Here's my CD. I'd like to introduce myself. And I started getting work. And within a year, I was getting triple scale, which was about $1,500 for an hour's session. So I had that going. Then as you get better known as a celebrity, there's a category called celebrity voiceovers, where you're not endorsing the product, but people recognize your voice, like Gene Hackman in United Airlines, or Martin Sheen in this one. You know the voice, and those things pay a lot. And because an actor is out of work so readily, I never made $1 million paydays. I was a working guy. Even in movies that I was a star, they were independent, low budget movies. And you work for 3 to 6 months, and suddenly you're out of work, and your bills are coming in, your mortgage, your tuition, your car payments, all of these things. So I had two great agents at ICM, and they started getting me big accounts. And those accounts would tide me over between jobs. I mean, when I did E.T., at the time, it was the highest selling movie of all time. I was out of work for a year. When I did The Jagged Edge, I was out of work for 9 months. So voiceovers were a really good option. And then my great good fortune was, well, first of all, I much preferred documentaries to ads, because nobody makes a documentary to get rich. People make a documentary because they're dedicated to the subject, it has importance, and they rarely get their money back. So I would do documentaries. I still do them, usually one a month or something for nothing. But my great good fortune was 28 years ago to meet Ken Burns and start working with him. I don't know if you've seen his long form documentaries in London, but they're very famous. 12 hours on Vietnam, 12 hours on the American Revolution. And what you call disappearing into the text is something that I practice pretty assiduously. There's a funny story about how we met. Ken Burns and I did a show called The West for two people who had produced The Civil War, which was a very famous and successful show of Ken Burns. And those two producers said, Ken Burns would like to meet you and talk to you about doing the national parks. And I said, okay. So he came to my hotel, and he's a small kind of elfin man, very, very smart. And he was carrying a big bundle of scripts and yellow legal pads. And there was a box of CDs. There was a box of pencils. There was a box of magic marker highlighters. And I said, what is that? What's all that? And he looked at me kind of like I was stupid. He said, these are the scripts. These are the highlighters so you can highlight your remarks. These are the DVDs so you can see the movie. And these are the pencils so you can make notes. And I said, oh no, man, I never read anything until I get into the studio. And he just froze. The room temperature dropped about 20 degrees. And he said, that will never work. You don't know how impeccable I am. And I said, you don't know how good I am. So there was a little standoff. He said, okay, I'll get a studio and we'll book it for a month. We'll try, but I don't think this is going to work. I said, no, it's 9 episodes. We'll do an episode and a half a day. Just book it for a week. We'll be fine. And on the third day, he jumped out of his chair. He said, I'll never use anyone else. Well, of course he has, but we've worked together for 28 years. And there's a reason why I never read anything first. And this relates to your question. If I try to make you feel a certain way, you're going to back up. you're going to feel manipulated. If I say this was such a sad moment, you're going to say, well, let me determine how sad it is. If I try to put any English on it that's not legitimate, the viewer feels manipulated. So what I do is I open myself to the text. I just put everything else out of my mind and I read the words, and the words act on my emotional system instinctively. And so there's always an appropriate feeling. There's always the truth of what I'm feeling is what's coming across. Now, there may be problems. He may need it a little quicker. He may need it another way. But that's why I do that. And I think that's probably 55 years of Buddhist training that allows me to set myself aside and just surrender to the script and be a blank slate so that each word sends little ripples and uh, movements through my emotions.
Okay.
You seem
Thank you.
unconvinced.
No, no. I'm just absorbing the message. So
Okay.
sorry. Okay. Thank you. No, thank you for clarifying this. I truly appreciate it. Yeah, let's jump to the next one. In 2011, you were ordained as a Zen Buddhist priest, taking the Dharma name Shundara Ro. You had already renamed yourself once in a peyote
No,
ceremony 50 years
my
earlier.
Dharma name is Hosho Jishi, which
Sorry,
means
my
Dharma
bad.
voice. Yeah, Dharma voice, compassion warrior. My teacher gave me that. I didn't name
Okay,
myself.
okay. Apologies for that, for the
That's
mistake.
okay.
But what does it mean to rename yourself a second time? Like, and is the person who accepted that ordination the same person who took the name Coyote in the desert, or are they
Well,
different?
I have no idea who that person is in either case. And we say in Zen practice, we say not knowing is nearest. If you think about it for a second, every idea you have about yourself has become a narrative that you've developed since people started talking to you. Since people began to teach you language, they began describing the world to you, and you were helpless to combat that definition. What a nice boy. Look at the pretty birdie. Lovely kitty. What sweet cheeks. Little by little, and by the time we're 6 or 7, we can run the movie of the world we've been taught without interruption. And one of the things we've been taught is that there's a self. Here's mommy. Here's daddy. Here's you. And so we assemble that self out of the way people respond to us. We assemble it out of ideas we have and that we want. And little by little, it forms a kind of narrative which is solid. And it gives us the idea that the self resembles an organ, that it has a physical coherence, which is a prison. So when you get to the point where you realize that that thing you call a self is just awareness, it's boundaryless, it's formless, and that everything you don't like or disapprove of yourself is basically a learned habit. And with discipline and perseverance, you can change it. You are entering the possibilities of nirvana. And what nirvana is, quite simply, is the ability in the next second to do something you've never done before. You can't do that if you're chained to an idea of a self, which has fixed properties. And the Buddha's central teaching is that everything changes. So if that self is like a gassy cloud of awareness, how can you possibly know who you are? You're inseparable from sunlight, from oxygen, from water, from microbes in the soil that made your food, from the people spinning the cotton in your t-shirt, sewing it, shipping it, selling it. So there are two truths simultaneously. One is that you have this body on loan for a while, and if I shoot myself, you don't fall down. So yes, we have self-awareness. But the other side of it is simultaneously, we're all part of one big picture, like ticks on the body of a dog. So it's keeping those two, being able to oscillate back and forth. So the big picture stops you from being too fixated on the self. And the self, the Chinese say the host is awareness because it's always home. And the self is a guest because it comes and goes. The body comes and goes. If the host doesn't know there's a guest, it has no capacity for experiencing the world. We need eyes, ears, nose, tongue, body, and mind to experience the world. And if the guest doesn't know there's a host, there's no possibility of transcendental wisdom. So it's kind of a game where you don't gel things too solidly.
So, three complete lives: the radical who gave everything away, the actor who told the world stories, the priest who submitted to a tradition. Which one was real? Or is that the wrong question entirely?
It's the wrong question. Everything's real. Everything's equally real. Even a pretense is real. Even a dream is a real dream. So the idea that there's a place you can stand outside of all of it, that's somehow pure and the essence. The fundament of Buddhist thinking is there is no essence. This is why, for instance, I've always had a problem with reincarnation. If the self is just awareness, if it can't exist without the body, if it's interdependent with blood, tissue, mass, muscle, eyes, ears, nose, tongue, body, mind, it doesn't have an independent existence. So what is it that body hops from body to body? So I've never fully bought that. But by the same token, awareness is not a personal property. Animals are aware, birds are aware, plants are aware. Awareness is kind of like the foundational energy that expresses itself as trees, bugs, dolphins, leopards, mountain ranges, civilizations. So it's all real.
You've lived more versions of freedom than almost anyone alive. Political freedom, creative freedom, spiritual freedom. What do most people misunderstand about what freedom actually is, in your opinion?
Best question you've asked. Freedom is meaningless without understanding limits. It's just meaningless. It's like a mental pet. It's a word. Most people think of it, it means I can do whatever I want when I want. But if you dump poison in the creek that runs through my house, you're going to kill my family. So I'm not going to let you do that. If you run your off-road vehicle through the beach where the turtles are breeding and sending their kids, there's not going to be any turtles. I'm not going to let you do that. So freedom is only meaningful within the understanding of limits. My freedom goes up to the edge of your pain. So if you respect that everything is an expression of what we call Buddha nature, or this energetic substrate of energy, everything is an expression of it. So if anything's holy, it's that energy. And so it means that everything which is an expression of it, even if you were a Christian, if you really thought and practiced, everything that God made would be holy. And you would treat it as an expression of his will and works, or her will and works. Because men don't create things. Women create things. Women create life. So I don't like the fact that I'm made as the exact same stuff as Donald Trump. I do not like it, but it's a fact. And I have no more standing in the universe than he does. You may like the way I behave better than the way he does, but I have no moral soapbox I can stand on that makes me a different part of the universe. So somehow I have to learn to contend with him and deal with him without hating him and without denigrating the energies of the universe that put him on this earth. That's the challenge of being a Buddhist. But it's also the challenge of being a Christian for those who take it seriously, or a Muslim.
Thank you. Thank you very much for sharing your views on this. I've got two more final questions related to the channel and the audiences that watch the channel. Rewarding yourself is watched mostly by young people who feel pulled between what the world wants them to be and what they actually are. Most of them are being told to pick a lane and stay in it forever or their life. You refuse that questions entirely and just lift. What would you say to them?
Well, I'll tell you a story. When my daughter was graduating high school, I went to her graduation, and a young kid came up to me and said, "Could I ask you a question?" I said, "Yeah." He said, "My father really wants me to go to college, but what I really love is playing music, and I want to play music. I don't know what to do." I said, "Why don't you make a deal with your father? Have him give you 2 years to try. So you go for the thing you really love and try it. And then if it doesn't work, you'll go to college. But don't sell your dream out. Don't sell your authentic self out." So about 5 years later, I was walking down the street in LA, and this little hairball of a kid comes up to me. He's got hair out to here and a beard and everything. He says, "Mr. Coyote, Mr. Coyote, I'm Adam. I'm Adam. And that's my band." And he points to the club where Counting Crows is playing. So my answer to that is be authentic. Because, Oscar Wilde said, "Be yourself. Every other role is taken." There's no amount of money they can pay you to betray yourself. My dad tried that. My dad was a drug addict. He was miserable. He was unhappy. He made millions and millions of dollars. He never knew who his kids were. His wife was broken by him. So I saw that right away. What's money going to get you? You look at these jerks that are supporting Donald Trump. How rich can you be? Everybody thinks Bezos is an idiot. Everybody thinks the guy from Facebook is an idiot. They're just corrupt. There are people that admire them, but these guys are not happy. Trust me, Steve Jobs was not a happy person. So I followed my curiosity my whole life. It's the only thing I did that was brave. I would get interested in something and I would follow it until I'd exhausted it. And then I'd see what the next thing was. So the world will always betray you, but your heart won't. If you sit and be quiet and open to what you really want, that's the path to follow that'll at least bring you peace. It may not bring riches, it may not bring fame, but look at how many famous people have committed suicide, overdosed, caused scandal and disrespect on their families. None of that stuff works. So I don't know. I was lucky.
Very powerful message. And I think this is exactly what I told you at the beginning, that the internet is sort of misleading and trying to pull all the people that we get all the freedom if we have financial freedom, and the worries will disappear completely from our lives. But that's not true. There will
You,
always be
you,
challenges,
you do
tough
need a certain
times, and
amount. You do need a certain amount. Even the old Zen masters would have to sell tea or make fans or something, but they learned to live on what they could make.
to have the right measure, so what we can handle and what we need, and not too
Thanks.
much of it.
Thanks. You ask good questions.
Thank you. Okay, I've got one last one. If your life had a message so far from everything you shared and wonderful stories, and I think our viewers will very much enjoy what you've shared and the honesty you put behind those stories, what would your final message be? That message of today from you directly.
Meditate. Take private time with yourself every day to touch base and get comfortable with what comes up. So, we only get in trouble when we run away from our feelings. There's nothing we can't handle if we're just sitting still and meditating. But when we're afraid of something that might come up, some old trauma, some guilt, something, it's when we run away that we wind up in the wrong bed or shopping or stealing or taking drugs or drinking. So the safest way to get your center of gravity is by giving yourself some private time, 20 minutes, sitting in a chair in front of the wall, just paying attention to your breathing and learning what comes up and learning in your bone marrow what's on your mind and looking at it and accepting it and figuring out how to come to terms with it. If you do that, you'll stay upright. You won't make probably too many disastrous mistakes. You'll make some.
Wonderful, Peter. Thank you very much. I truly appreciate your time. I think time is the most valuable commodity anyone can give someone, more valuable than anything else in this world. And I'm very grateful for your time and stories, and accepting my invitation to this channel. And I think the stories were very great and inspirational, and I think there's some lessons to be learned from.
I thank you for good questions.
Wonderful. Thank you.